The story of the mutants in Fallout cannot begin anywhere but with the creation of the Forced Evolutionary Virus, the most consequential scientific discovery and subsequent bioweapon experiment in the post-war world. And to understand its origins, we must look to the final years before the Great War, when global tensions between the United States, China, and the rest of the world had escalated into a frantic technological arms race. West Tek, a leading defense contractor already known for its work on advanced energy weapons and power armor, was commissioned by the U.S. government under a Department of Defense contract to research viral-based treatments that could increase human resistance to disease, chemical weapons, and nuclear fallout, a program that officially began as a response to the new plague that spread across the globe during the 2050 seconds, which itself prompted the United States to prioritize immunological research as a matter of national security. It was within this crucible of desperation that West Tek's team of virologists, geneticists, and military scientists developed the Pan-Immunity Virion Project, an ambitious effort to create a virus that would rewrite human DNA in such a way that individuals would gain immunity to virtually all pathogens and toxins. And it was from this project that the Forced Evolutionary Virus, later simply known as FEV, was born, though its purpose would quickly diverge from its original humanitarian-sounding goals, as the government and military recognized its potential not just as a cure-all, but as a tool to engineer soldiers capable of thriving in irradiated battlefields and immune to chemical and biological weapons, effectively making them post-human super-soldiers. The science behind FEV was as dangerous as it was groundbreaking, for the virus functioned as a shifting, mutagenic retrovirus with no RNA or DNA sequence of its own, instead relying on forced assimilation of host genetic material, rewriting it in a way that caused the duplication of nucleotides and the introduction of redundancy in genetic code, leading to enhanced cell division, improved muscular and neural growth, and near-total resistance to disease and aging. But the trade-off was massive sterility, grotesque changes in appearance, and wildly unpredictable outcomes depending on the host's initial genetic stability. The earliest lab trials conducted by West Tek demonstrated that animal test subjects exposed to FEV grew in size and strength, sometimes exponentially, while also exhibiting new secondary characteristics and often violent behavior. And as the months wore on, it became increasingly clear to project leaders that the virus, though unstable, it could be directed toward military applications, leading to deeper levels of classified research and the eventual militarization of the Pan-Immunity Virion Project. By 2073, official Department of Defense records described FEV as a key component of Project Safehouse, the government's broader continuity of government initiative that included the construction of vaults, though in practice, FEV was more tightly tied to the development of biological warfare countermeasures and augmentation than to the civilian vault program itself, and the secrecy surrounding it grew so intense that only select individuals within West Tek and the highest echelons of the military knew of its existence. The true acceleration point for FEV research came in 2076, when a government inspection team visited the West Tek laboratories and formally classified the project under the highest security clearances, labeling it top secret and allocating massive new funding and resources under the guise of war preparedness, an order that effectively transformed the virus from a fringe immunological experiment into one of the most important classified weapons programs of the pre-war United States. As the Great War drew nearer, West Tek's researchers continued to refine and test the virus, though they remained divided on whether it could ever be applied safely, with some believing it might eventually serve as a universal cure, while others saw it only as a means of forced evolution, a way to bypass natural selection entirely and artificially guide humanity into a form more suited to the hostile, irradiated environment that everyone knew was coming. But the ethical concerns of dissenting scientists were ignored or silenced as the US military took greater control, culminating in the establishment of the Mariposa military base in California, a site dedicated specifically to secure experimentation on human subjects using FEV under strict military oversight. This facility, staffed by soldiers loyal to the program and scientists either coerced or ideologically committed, became the crucible in which the first true supermutants would eventually be forged, though at the time it was viewed as just another component of a sprawling wartime research effort. What is most striking about these origins is how FEV, a creation born of fear and desperation, represented the duality of pre-war America, at once driven by genuine scientific brilliance and yet fatally compromised by the paranoia and militarism of its age. For in a world on the brink of nuclear annihilation, the promise of an indestructible soldier, immune to plague, radiation, and chemical agents, was irresistible, and so the foundations were laid for the creation of mutants, a legacy not of nature's chaos, but of deliberate human ambition and hubris, with the end result being not salvation, but the genesis of a new race of beings that would define the post-apocalyptic wasteland by the 23rd of October 2077. When the bombs finally fell, the virus had already been completed and stored at Mariposa, and the West Tek main facility itself had been targeted by Chinese nuclear strikes, eradicating much of the original data and killing countless researchers. But FEV survived in secure installations, waiting for discovery in the ashes of the old world, ensuring that long after the war's firestorms faded, the legacy of mutation would rise and stalk humanity across the wasteland, a legacy inseparable from the very origins of the Forced Evolutionary Virus itself. When the United States military seized full control of the Forced Evolutionary Virus and established the Mariposa military base in California, the direction of the project shifted decisively from theoretical research into applied human experimentation, for it was at Mariposa that the military's vision of an evolved soldier, immune to radiation, chemical weapons, and biological agents would be tested not on animals or computer models, but on live human beings, a choice that would lay the groundwork for the emergence of the supermutants and ultimately shape the course of post-war history. Mariposa was constructed in secrecy, a remote facility staffed not just with West Tek scientists, but with military guards sworn to silence and indoctrinated with the belief that their work, however extreme, was essential to the survival of America, and within its laboratories enormous vats of green, viscous fluid containing concentrated strains of FEV were prepared for use, each capable of submerging a human test subject entirely. For the viral immersion process required total saturation in order to allow the virus to penetrate cellular membranes and begin its forced genetic rewriting. The military, under the auspices of black-budget programs, authorized experiments on military prisoners and political dissidents, men deemed expendable by the state, and they became the first unwilling test subjects, stripped of rights and subjected to complete immersion in the FEV vats. And the results, while horrifying, were nothing short of transformative. Subjects who survived the process emerged larger, stronger, and resistant to radiation. with enhanced musculature and cellular regeneration, but their skin became uniformly greenish and leathery. Their reproductive organs were rendered non-functional, and their facial features distorted, a side effect of the virus's indiscriminate rewriting of genetic code. The early Mariposa subjects were the prototypes of what would become known as super mutants, towering beings far beyond ordinary humans, capable of lifting weights that would have been impossible for their unmutated counterparts. Yet, mentally, they presented anomalies, for while some retained human-level intelligence, and in rare cases even improved cognitive function, others emerged severely impaired, with diminished reasoning skills and increased aggression, a variance that baffled scientists and alarmed the military, but was tolerated because of the virus's overwhelming success at creating resilient soldiers. Records from this period, preserved in Fallout lore through logs and holotapes, suggest that the FEV did not simply mutate human DNA randomly, but instead worked by introducing redundancy into the genome, creating multiple copies of genetic sequences that enhanced biological processes, meaning that supermutants effectively had backups of their cellular functions, granting them durability and healing capacity that bordered on the superhuman. And yet this process also disrupted fertility and uniformity of thought, making them sterile and, in many cases, unstable. Despite these side effects, the military pressed forward, convinced that FEV represented a viable path to an unstoppable army, though ethical concerns began to fracture the team at Mariposa, with certain scientists expressing horror at the dehumanization of the test subjects, while others justified it as a necessary sacrifice for the survival of the United States, a divide that would foreshadow the moral crises that would come when the project was revealed to outsiders. By late 2077, the Mariposa staff had carried out dozens of successful transformations, filling containment cells with hulking mutants who were studied, dissected, and in some cases trained for obedience. Though the question of their long-term viability as soldiers remained open, as many exhibited violent tendencies and resisted control. However, before these concerns could be resolved, the world above Mariposa was obliterated on the 23rd of October 2077, when nuclear fire consumed the planet during the Great War, and the sudden collapse of the government that had ordered the experiments left the base in a strange limbo, sealed from the outside world, and still operational, with both military personnel and scientists alive within its reinforced bunkers, surrounded by their monstrous creations and the vats of virus that had given birth to them. The years immediately following the Great War are shrouded in mystery, but it is known that Mariposa remained intact and that within its walls the FEV experiments continued in some form, either under the discipline of surviving officers or the curiosity of scientists who no longer had a chain of command, and it was into this environment that Richard Gray, a scavenger from the wasteland, would one day fall and be transformed into the Master. But before that infamous event, the groundwork for the entire mutant legacy had already been laid by the brutal pragmatism of Mariposa, for it was here that the virus's capacity to reshape humanity on a massive scale was proven beyond doubt, and it was here that the first generation of supermutants, unwilling products of the military's obsession with survival at any cost, were created, their existence a living testament to the hubris of pre-war America and the dark promise of evolution, forced by science without restraint. A promise that would not remain contained within Mariposa's walls, but would one day march out into the wasteland in search of purpose, conquest, and unity, forever changing the post-nuclear world. Among the many tales that rose from the ashes of the Great War, none is as pivotal to the history of mutants as the fate of Richard Moreau, later known as Richard Gray, a doctor and scientific mind who would, through accident and circumstance, become the Master, the most infamous mutant ever to exist. For his transformation was not the result of deliberate military experimentation like those carried out on prisoners at Mariposa, but rather the culmination of chance, curiosity, and a horrific encounter with the Forced Evolutionary Virus that permanently fused man and mutation into a single entity, driven by vision and obsession. Gray's story began in Vault 8, later known as Vault City, from which he was exiled after a medical malpractice incident, taking the name Richard Gray and wandering the wasteland until he joined a caravan expedition in 2102, led by a man named Harold, the same Harold who would later become a ghoul of great renown, and together they set out from the hub toward the north, a journey motivated by curiosity, survival, and the hope of scavenging technology from pre-war military installations. Their travels led them into the irradiated ruins of California, until at last they stumbled upon the Mariposa military base, still sealed and intact decades after the bombs had fallen, its walls hiding not only the research of West Tek, but the dormant guarded vats of FEV that had been preserved beneath layers of concrete and steel. Believing the base to be a source of valuable technology, the expedition pushed forward, only to be slaughtered almost immediately by the automated defenses and surviving security systems, with turrets and robotic protectors decimating the caravan and leaving only a handful of survivors, among them Harold and Gray. Determined to discover the secrets within, Gray ventured deeper into Mariposa's labyrinth of laboratories, where he encountered the containment vats, the very same pools of green viral fluid used to submerge human subjects during the pre-war experiments. But as he attempted to study the facility, he was attacked by a robotic defense mechanism, dragged, and ultimately cast into one of the vats, where his body was completely immersed in FEV. Unlike the structured immersions of the original experiments, which were monitored and often fatal, Gray's exposure was uncontrolled and prolonged, and the virus not only rewrote his DNA, but destabilized his cellular integrity, breaking down the boundaries between his cells and allowing him to absorb other organisms into his mutagenic mass, a transformation that lasted weeks as he writhed within the vats, drifting between death and rebirth, his consciousness splintered, but preserved by the virus's enforced redundancy. When Gray finally emerged from the vats, he was no longer the man who had entered, for his body had lost any fixed form, his flesh reshaping itself endlessly, and his mind, augmented by the neural amplification side effects of the virus, expanded far beyond human limitations, granting him both heightened intelligence and the capacity for telepathic projection, though at the cost of his sanity, as the constant mutation and the absorption of other organisms filled his mind with countless voices and impulses that would plague him for the rest of his existence. Gray abandoned his old name, embracing instead the identity of the Master, for he saw himself not merely as a survivor of FEV, but as its perfected product, a being who could guide humanity into its next stage. And in the years following his emergence, he began to spread outward from Mariposa, using his newfound abilities and the remaining mutant creatures within the base to establish a growing power. The Master quickly recognized that the sterility of supermutants was a flaw that could not be ignored, and thus he conceived of a plan he called the Unity, a vision wherein all of humanity would be transformed by FEV, creating a single race of superior beings that would eliminate conflict, prejudice, and weakness by erasing difference itself. For if every human were a mutant, then there could be no war between factions, no division between races, only strength and collective survival in a world ruined by nuclear fire. To accomplish this, the Master began to organize the scattered remnants of Mariposa's mutant subjects, gathering them under his will and directing them to capture new test subjects from the wasteland, creating more mutants through immersion in the vats, and expanding his army one conscript at a time, while also experimenting with the blending of human and mutant physiology to refine the process. It was during these years that Harold, who had also been exposed to FEV during the expedition, albeit in smaller doses, developed into a ghoul, a living testament to the virus's unpredictable nature. But unlike Harold, who wandered the wasteland sharing fragments of his story, the Master remained at Mariposa, consolidating power, developing his ideology, and establishing contact with the newly emerging human settlements of the wasteland, eventually moving his base of operations to the ruins of Los Angeles, where he took residence in the Boneyards Cathedral, using its religious trappings to mask his growing cult. The children of the cathedral, who worshipped him as a divine figure and spread his philosophy under the guise of faith, recruiting both human followers and new candidates for mutation. It was here that the Master's mind, now a fusion of Richard Gray's scientific knowledge and the vast hive of consciousness absorbed through the virus, crafted a narrative of salvation through forced evolution, a story that persuaded many to join his cause willingly, while also justifying the violent conscription of others, and thus by the time the Vault Dweller emerged from Vault 13 inches 2161, the Master had already established himself as the central power in Southern California, commanding an army of super-mutants produced from the vats, guided by the unwavering ideology of the Unity, and supported by a fanatical human cult that believed in his divinity. Yet for all his ambition, the Master remained flawed, for the sterility of supermutants remained unsolved, and though his intelligence allowed him to see the larger picture, his fractured mind left him prone to instability, paranoia, and delusions, qualities that would eventually contribute to his downfall. But in the context of mutant history, his transformation represented the turning point at which FEV ceased to be merely a tool of the military and instead became the foundation of a new species and a new ideology, for without Richard Gray's fall into the vats and his rebirth as the Master, the supermutants might have remained scattered remnants of a pre-war experiment. Yet with his vision they became an organized force, a faction capable of reshaping the wasteland itself, and his life stands as the definitive origin story of mutants as a social and political power, the genesis of their culture, their armies, and their enduring place in the mythology of Fallout's post-nuclear world. The culmination of Richard Gray's horrific transformation into the Master was not merely his own survival, but the crystallization of an ideology that came to be known as the Unity, a vision of a future in which the divisions that had destroyed humanity in the Great War would be erased by the homogenizing power of the Forced Evolutionary Virus. For in the Master's fractured yet expansive mind, the endless wars, hatreds, and selfish pursuits of humankind were symptoms of their diversity and weakness, flaws that could only be overcome if all men and women were uplifted into a single race of supermutants who, in their physical strength, intellectual potential, and biological resilience, would rise above the mistakes of their forebears and inherit the nuclear wasteland as its rightful rulers. To achieve this, the Master began to mobilize the resources at his disposal, turning Mariposa's vats into production lines of mutation and expanding his reach from the ruined laboratories to the wider wasteland, capturing humans through raids, ambushes, and the subversive recruitment of the children of the cathedral, his human cult, whose guise of religious salvation masked their true function as feeders for the Unity's war machine. Every human brought before the vats was a candidate for transformation, though success was not guaranteed, for FEV's effects varied according to genetic purity, and those with too much radiation exposure, hereditary defects, or insufficient physiological stability often became grotesque failures, collapsing into malformed creatures like centaurs or dying outright. Yet those who survived became towering supermutants, uniform in appearance, muscular, green-skinned, sterile, and loyal to their new identity. For the Master's influence, through indoctrination, the guidance of the children, and in some cases his own telepathic abilities, bound them to the cause, instilling in them the belief that they were the chosen inheritors of the earth. The Master understood that brute force alone would not achieve his goals, and so he built his Unity not only as an army, but as a culture, a society with purpose, telling his mutants that they were not monsters, but the next stage of evolution, and that humanity's refusal to submit was an act of ignorance that would ultimately be corrected either by persuasion or by assimilation. By the early 2162, the Unity had become a formidable faction in Southern California, its presence stretching from the cathedral in the ruins of Los Angeles to the hidden laboratories of Mariposa, with patrols of supermutants roaming the wastes, capturing villages, and striking terror into human settlements, while at the same time spreading the message of the children of the cathedral, who opened hospitals, offered aid, and preached salvation, their outward benevolence concealing their darker purpose of identifying healthy human stock for mutation. Under the Master's leadership, the supermutants became organized with a military precision unseen in most wasteland factions, forming battalions, building armories, and manufacturing weapons, their sheer size and resilience making them fearsome in combat, able to endure bullets and radiation alike, and their disciplined formations demonstrating that they were far more than mindless brutes, though outsiders often underestimated them as such. This underestimation was part of the Master's strategy, for he allowed humans to think of the supermutants as dumb monsters, even while he cultivated intelligence and leadership within their ranks, raising commanders who could oversee entire operations, and among them, figures like Lieutenant and Lieutenant became notorious for their efficiency and ruthlessness. Yet, despite their growing strength, the Unity faced inherent challenges, chief among them the problem of reproduction. For every supermutant was sterile, a fact that the Master recognized but sought to rationalize through his ideology, declaring that the Unity did not need natural reproduction so long as humanity continued to resist, for there would always be fresh stock to convert, and thus the conquest of humankind was not merely a necessity of ideology, but of biology, for without a constant supply of new recruits, the supermutant race could not sustain itself. This reality drove the Unity's expansionist aggression, making them a looming threat to every human settlement in the region, from Shady Sands to Junktown. For once the Unity reached critical mass, it would march outward in a tide of green flesh and iron discipline, overwhelming the fractured, unorganized communities of the wasteland and uniting them under a single evolutionary destiny. But the Unity was not merely a plan for conquest, it was also the Master's attempt to bring coherence to his own fractured mind, for within him, The voices of those he had absorbed clamored and contradicted one another, and the unity was his way of imposing order on the chaos, projecting a vision of harmony that he himself could not achieve internally. And it was perhaps this paradox that both fueled his conviction and sowed the seeds of his downfall. Nevertheless, in the years between 2102 and 2161, the unity grew from the twisted vision of one man into the dominant force in Southern California, commanding loyalty, not only from supermutants and the children of the cathedral, but also from those wastelanders who were seduced by promises of strength, safety, or salvation. And by the time the Vault Dweller stepped into the wasteland, the unity had already infiltrated and threatened nearly every corner of civilization, preparing to enact its final phase, the forced assimilation of all humanity into the mutant collective, the eradication of resistance, and the birth of a new world where the word human would no longer exist. Only mutant, only unity, only the future as imagined by the Master, whose rise from the vats of Mariposa had transformed him into both prophet and tyrant of a new species destined to forever shape the post-nuclear world. While the supermutants of the Unity represented the intended outcome of the Forced Evolutionary Virus, as envisioned by the Master, the truth of mutation was far less perfect than the ideology proclaimed. For, alongside the towering green soldiers who embodied strength and discipline, there existed the grotesque failures of the vats, creatures twisted beyond recognition, that served as reminders of the virus's unpredictability and as tools of terror within the ranks of the mutant army. And none were more infamous than the centaurs, abominations born not from careful immersion of healthy human subjects, but from the accidental or deliberate combination of multiple organisms fused together by the chaotic rewriting of FEV. There forms a nightmare of mismatched anatomy that defied natural order. Centaurs varied in appearance, but were generally characterized by their semi-humanoid torsos grafted onto masses of flesh, tentacles, and malformed limbs, with slick, rubbery skin often stretched unnaturally over bone and muscle, mouths lined with irregular teeth, and tongues elongated into whip-like appendages, and in some cases, multiple heads or faces fused into a single mass, the result of FEV blending incompatible genetic material, without regard for symmetry or function, producing living weapons of horror rather than stable beings. Their origins are recorded in Fallout's canon as the byproduct of FEV experiments at Mariposa and later at Vault 87, with their earliest appearances tied directly to the Master's forces, who saw in them not failed soldiers but useful creatures whose terrifying presence could augment the psychological impact of supermutant raids. For centaurs were unleashed alongside their larger brethren to sow panic, hunt stragglers, and overwhelm defenders with their erratic but lethal attacks. The Master himself regarded centaurs as valuable tools, not to be wasted, but deployed in roles suited to their grotesque talents, such as scouts, shock troops, and guardians of key facilities. For though they lacked the intelligence of true supermutants, their loyalty was absolute, and their strength considerable, their mutations granting them resistance to radiation and disease, just as in their more stable kin, but without the burden of free thought or the risk of rebellion. The process that created centaurs was not as systematic as the immersion of human candidates into vats, but often the result of discarding unsuitable subjects into the viral pools, including humans with too much radiation exposure, contaminated DNA, or non-human animals captured during raids, all of which were fused by the virus into hybrid monstrosities ensuring that nothing was wasted and that every failed experiment might still contribute to the Unity's arsenal. In this sense, centaurs represented the ruthless efficiency of the Master's ideology, the belief that all could be united under the virus, even if the result was not the idealized form of the supermutant. For in the Master's mind, these creatures were still part of the Unity, still manifestations of the great transformation that would one day engulf the Earth. And so their existence was rationalized, not as failure, but as diversity within the whole, another expression of evolution forced upon the world. Beyond centaurs, there were other aberrations of FEV that emerged during the era of the Unity, such as floaters, arthropod-like monstrosities with elongated tentacles and armored hides, also originating from Mariposa experiments, which alongside centaurs underscored the fact that mutation was not a clean or predictable process, but one prone to horrific outcomes. Each new creature, a testament to the uncontrollable power of FEV and the reckless ambition of those who wielded it. In practice, however, the dominance of centaurs within mutant ranks cemented their place as the most recognizable of the failed mutants, and their presence endured long after the fall of the Master, for they were not limited to his army alone, but reappeared in subsequent regions touched by FEV, most notably in the Capital Wasteland, where Vault 87's unique strain of the virus produced centaurs with different yet equally horrifying characteristics, multi-limbed horrors whose tentacles could ensnare prey and whose loyalty to the supermutants remained unwavering. These later centaurs revealed that failure was intrinsic to the FEV process itself, no matter the strain or facility, for wherever humans and animals were exposed without precise conditions, monstrosities inevitably arose, reinforcing the tragic reality that mutation was as much a generator of nightmares as it was of soldiers, and that for every disciplined supermutant that marched under a banner, there were countless failures writhing in the shadows, twisted beyond recovery. What made centaurs particularly significant in the history of mutants was not simply their role as shock troops, but their symbolic value, for they embodied the cost of the Master's vision, the human beings who had been promised evolution but instead became horrors, stripped of intelligence, identity, and dignity, reduced to little more than beasts in service to a cause they could not understand in their existence. A stark reminder that the Unity's rhetoric of salvation was built upon a foundation of suffering and exploitation, and though the Master may have claimed that they too were part of the whole, the reality was that centaurs were victims as much as they were weapons, their lives sacrificed to the altar of forced evolution. Yet, in the wasteland, perception mattered as much as reality, and to the human settlements that faced mutant incursions, the sight of a centaur slithering and screeching alongside towering supermutants was a terror unmatched, an image that cemented the reputation of the mutants not only as conquerors, but as monsters. And this fear would endure in cultural memory, ensuring that even after the fall of the Unity, mutants everywhere would be associated with the horrors of the vats as much as with the ideology of the Master. Thus, centaurs and other failed mutants stand as essential parts of mutant history, not mere footnotes, but integral players in the story, for they demonstrate both the limits of FEV's promise and the depths of its danger. Creatures born not of natural selection, but of human arrogance, forged in vats of green liquid as accidents that nonetheless became weapons, forever tied to the legacy of the supermutants and the Unity that sought to redefine what it meant to be human in a world where humanity had already been destroyed. The story of the Master and his dream of the Unity reaches its climax in the final days of his reign beneath the cathedral, when the ideological movement that had grown from Mariposa's vats into a continent-spanning threat was undone not by superior force, but by the combined weight of truth, dissent, and the determination of one individual known to history only as the Vault Dweller. For though the super mutants and their centaur auxiliaries represented a terrifying military power capable of overwhelming isolated settlements and even challenging the remnants of the Brotherhood of Steel, their entire structure rested upon the singular will and vision of the Master, a being whose intelligence had been magnified by FEV, but whose perspective had been narrowed by the certainty of his ideology. And it was this weakness that ultimately opened the path to his destruction. The Vault Dweller's journey into the wastes began not with the goal of toppling the Unity, but with the pragmatic mission of saving Vault 13 through the recovery of a water chip. Yet fate and curiosity drew the Dweller deeper into the mysteries of the wasteland, where the shadow of the mutants could be felt in the rumors of raids, the whispers of a growing army, and the spread of the cathedral's religious influence, which cloaked the Master's designs beneath layers of doctrine and zealotry. It was within this environment that the Vault Dweller uncovered the truth of the super mutants, first through encounters with their patrols, and later by piecing together the fragments of information held by the Brotherhood, the followers of the Apocalypse, and scattered witnesses, each revelation painting a clearer picture of the Unity's plan to forcibly mutate all humanity into a single, superior species, a vision justified by the Master as the only way to prevent future nuclear wars, for a world of one race could never know division. Though the truth hidden beneath this idealism was that the Master's vision rested on flawed assumptions and a refusal to accept the diversity of humankind. The turning point came when the Vault Dweller infiltrated the cathedral, discovering the sprawling underground complex where the Master resided within a writhing mass of flesh and machinery. A grotesque embodiment of FEV's power and horror, his body no longer human but a fusion of tissues, tentacles, and cybernetics sustained by the supercomputer of the West Tek installation, a form both terrifying and awe-inspiring to those who witnessed it. And here the Vault Dweller was confronted not merely with a physical foe, but with an intellectual challenge. For the Master did not see himself as a tyrant to be toppled, but as a prophet whose vision could not be questioned, and he sought to convince the intruder of the necessity of unity, confident that logic itself would validate his cause. Yet it was logic that undid him, for the Vault Dweller, armed with evidence gathered across the wasteland, revealed the fatal flaw in the Unity's foundation. The sterility of supermutants created through FEV, a biological truth confirmed by experiments at the Brotherhood, and observable in the mutants themselves, whose bodies, while powerful, were incapable of producing offspring, meaning that the Unity could never achieve its promised future. For without natural reproduction, the mutated race would wither once their forced conversions were complete, leaving only extinction in place of unity. This revelation shattered the Master's certainty, his vast mind reeling from the incontrovertible truth that his dream was not salvation but annihilation, and for the first time his ideology collapsed beneath the weight of contradiction. His voice, once so confident and commanding, faltering as he questioned himself, his faith, and his entire existence. And though some accounts suggest that the Vault Dweller could also destroy him through direct violence, or the detonation of a nuclear device hidden beneath the cathedral, the canonical truth accepted within Fallout's lore is that the Vault Dweller's words were the decisive weapon, for the Master, faced with the undeniable futility of his dream, chose to end it himself. activating the self-destruct systems within the cathedral's nuclear stockpile, and consigning his body, his army, and his ideology to flames. The detonation annihilated the cathedral in a cataclysm of fire, scattering the Unity's forces and erasing their central command structure in a single moment, an act that reverberated across the wasteland. For settlements long terrorized by mutant raids suddenly found themselves free, their oppressors leaderless and disorganized, while the Brotherhood of Steel, who had prepared for a drawn-out war against the mutants, found victory handed to them by the actions of a lone wanderer whose name would be remembered only as the Vault Dweller, the first great hero of the post-nuclear age. The fall of the Master marked more than the end of a faction, for it represented the collapse of the most ambitious attempt to reshape humanity through FEV. A reminder that ideology built upon coercion and distortion of nature could not endure, and though supermutants would continue to roam the wasteland, fighting, settling, and struggling with their identity, they would never again be united under a vision so sweeping. For without the Master's guiding intellect, the Unity fragmented into scattered warbands, mercenaries, and isolated communities, each carrying with them fragments of their former glory, but none able to rekindle the dream. The legacy of the Master himself became a subject of fascination and fear among scholars, some seeing him as a tragic figure undone by the very logic he revered, others as a tyrant whose destruction was necessary to preserve what remained of human freedom. Yet in every interpretation, the lesson was the same, that mutation alone could not save humanity, and that even the most powerful intellect, magnified by FEV and technology, could not overcome the flaws of a plan divorced from the realities of biology and the will of those it sought to control. Thus, the fall of the Master stands as one of the pivotal moments in Fallout history. The moment when the dream of unity gave way to the fractured reality of a world that refused to be reshaped, a story told and retold in whispers and records, shaping the perception of mutants forever. For in the human mind, they would always be linked to the cathedral, the vats, and the catastrophic detonation that marked the end of their first great empire. Among the various branches of supermutants that emerged from the Forced Evolutionary Virus, none were more enigmatic or tragic than the Nightkin, an elite class of mutants created from the Vault 87 strain of FEV and distinguished not only by their exceptional strength and intelligence, but also by their mastery of stealth technology, most notably the use of stealth boys, portable devices capable of rendering their wearer effectively invisible to the naked eye, a technological boon that would both empower their tactical dominance and precipitate the unraveling of their culture. For while the Master's original unity had relied on sheer physical might and the cohesion of ideology, the Nightkin evolved from the need to operate in smaller, specialized units capable of reconnaissance, infiltration, and assassination, a reflection of the post-Master wasteland, where dispersed settlements and independent human factions demanded a different approach to survival and conquest. The Nightkin were originally formed in Vault 87 prior to the Great War, where the US government and West Tek had continued FEV experimentation on human volunteers in secret, seeking to perfect the supermutant form and produce soldiers of unprecedented capability, and these Vault experiments yielded mutants with enhanced intelligence relative to their Vault 87 peers, giving rise to a hierarchical structure in which the Nightkin operated as leaders, tacticians, and enforcers within the Vault. Their advanced cognitive function, allowing them to manipulate both human and mutant subjects, plan complex operations, and adapt to changing circumstances in ways ordinary supermutants could not, effectively creating a genetically enhanced officer class within the broader supermutant population. However, the Nightkin's dependence on stealth boys, while initially an innovation, became both a literal and metaphorical crutch, as long-term use of the devices altered their perceptions, rewiring neural pathways and inducing severe psychological effects, including paranoia, dissociation, and auditory hallucinations, with many Nightkin believing themselves to be invisible even without the device or mistaking their allies for enemies, a side effect of the prolonged quantum cloaking interference with normal brain function, and over decades these effects compounded, creating a fractured and erratic society within Vault 87 and its surviving outposts in the Capital Wasteland, demonstrating that even the most carefully engineered mutants were not immune to the unintended consequences of FEV and technological augmentation. Nightkin culture, to the extent that it could be called such, revolved around secrecy, ritualized hierarchy, and the veneration of stealth boys as both tools and symbols of status, with those most proficient in stealth operations commanding respect, while those who suffered severe psychological fragmentation often became outcasts, aggressors, or self-imposed hermits, wandering the irradiated corridors of the vault and the surrounding wasteland, their behavior oscillating between discipline deficiency in combat and sudden, unpredictable acts of violence against each other and against humans, further illustrating the precarious balance between genius and instability inherent in FEV mutation. The Nightkin's expansion into the Capital Wasteland, largely following the collapse of the Masters' unity, marked both the height of their influence and the beginning of their decline, for as independent supermutant factions sought to consolidate power, Nightkin emerged as both elite soldiers and as a cautionary tale of mutation run unchecked, their advanced intelligence allowing them to negotiate, enforce, or coerce, while their hallucinatory dependence on stealth technology undermined their cohesion, often resulting in splintered warbands, internecine conflict, and exposure to human reprisals, all of which reinforced the notion that mutation alone, even when coupled with advanced technology, could not guarantee lasting dominance in the wasteland. Furthermore, Nightkin were notable for their efforts to preserve and expand mutant knowledge, often capturing human records, holotapes, and technical manuals. Yet their obsessive secrecy and growing paranoia made the dissemination of this information sporadic and unreliable, so that subsequent generations of supermutants outside of Nightkin influence remained largely uninformed of these technological advantages, contributing to the fragmentation of mutant societies across the Capital Wasteland and beyond. In addition to their intellectual and technological capabilities, Nightkin often served as intermediaries between other supermutant groups, human settlements, and independent factions, their abilities enabling them to conduct espionage, coordinate raids, and enforce territorial control, a role that both reinforced their status as an elite caste and subjected them to extraordinary stress, as the constant requirement for vigilance, strategic planning, and the management of subordinate mutants created psychological strain that amplified the effects of prolonged stealth boy use, leading to widespread mental deterioration over time, with some Nightkin succumbing to complete psychosis, living in isolation, or developing ritualized behaviors that further alienated them from both humans and fellow mutants. The social structure of Nightkin, heavily influenced by both the Vault 87 hierarchy and their reliance on technology, reflected the complex interplay between genetic enhancement, environmental pressure, and the unintended consequences of experimental science. And it is within this context that their eventual decline must be understood, for while they represented the pinnacle of supermutant capability in terms of intelligence, stealth, and coordination, their reliance on artificial augmentation and the mental instability induced by FEV exposure meant that they could not form a sustainable society, and their numbers dwindled as splintered warbands fell to human militias, rival mutants, or internal collapse, leaving only isolated survivors, such as the members encountered in Fallout 3 near Big Town, individuals who bore the physical power and tactical training of their ancestors, but suffered from hallucinations, social dysfunction, and obsessive secrecy, a living testament to both the potential and peril of advanced mutation. Ultimately, the Nightkin embody the paradox of super-mutant evolution. The combination of intelligence, discipline, and genetic enhancement produced beings of extraordinary capability. Yet the same factors, combined with environmental stresses and technological dependency, led inexorably to instability, factionalism, and psychological collapse, demonstrating that mutation in the Fallout universe is as much a gamble as it is a tool of survival, and that even the most advanced specimens, when isolated from guiding ideology or social cohesion, are subject to the limitations of both mind and circumstance. Their legacy endures not merely in the historical record, but in the stories passed among humans and mutants alike, where tales of invisible assassins, silent stalkers, and once great tacticians who now wander the wastes in madness serve as a cautionary reminder of the consequences of forced evolution, the ethical ambiguities of experimentation, and the fragile balance between power and sanity, and in this sense, the Nightkin remain an integral chapter in the ongoing saga of mutants, bridging the gap between the structured, purpose-driven army of the Master and the scattered, often autonomous mutant communities that would populate the wasteland for centuries to come. Following the collapse of the Master and the destruction of the Unity, the landscape of mutant society shifted dramatically, leaving the supermutants as a fractured but enduring presence in the wasteland, and it is within this post-Master context that the events depicted in Fallout 2 illustrate the adaptive capacity, survival strategies, and evolving social structures of mutants as they sought to establish identity, security, and purpose in a world no longer dominated by a single unifying ideology, for the power vacuum created by the Master's demise allowed disparate mutant factions to emerge across the former territories of Southern California and beyond, each interpreting the lessons of the Unity in ways suited to their circumstances, and in particular, the settlements of Broken Hills and the leadership of Marcus represent the most notable example of mutants establishing their own governance, economic system, and interaction with human communities while remaining true to the fundamental strengths conferred by the Forced Evolutionary Virus. Broken Hills, located in a relatively secluded and defensible area of the wasteland, became a model for mutant self-sufficiency, populated primarily by supermutants who had survived the collapse of the Master's army, and by others who had fled Mariposa or Vault 87, and under Marcus, a former Vault 13 dweller who had himself been transformed by FEV, the community developed a pragmatic approach to coexistence with humans, blending military discipline, self-governance, and selective trade to create a stable environment for supermutants whose physical might made them both formidable protectors and intimidating neighbors. Marcus, whose intelligence and charisma placed him at the apex of Broken Hill's society, was emblematic of the postmaster leadership model, combining strategic foresight with ethical consideration, recognizing the dangers inherent in unbridled aggression, and establishing rules and systems to prevent the internal strife and chaos that had contributed to the downfall of the Unity, such as codified laws regarding raids, careful management of resources, and a council of elders drawn from experienced mutants to advise on governance, training, and defense, creating a community that, while militarily capable, was socially cohesive and capable of long-term stability in a world defined by scarcity and threat. Beyond the physical and administrative organization of Broken Hills, the mutants under Marcus also displayed a cultural sophistication that had not been present under the Master, incorporating rituals, oral history, and structured mentorship to transmit knowledge of FEV, combat tactics, and survival skills to successive generations, a form of social continuity that allowed the mutants to retain their unique identity while also navigating the complex political and environmental challenges of the post-nuclear landscape. And in doing so, they demonstrated that mutants could evolve culturally as well as biologically, bridging the gap between their origins as experimental subjects and their emergence as autonomous actors in the wasteland. The interaction between Broken Hills and nearby human settlements was carefully calibrated, with Marcus enforcing policies that emphasized diplomacy, trade, and the deterrence of aggression, seeking to avoid the mistakes of the Master, whose pursuit of forced conversion had provoked universal resistance, and instead positioning his community as a stable, respected, and self-sufficient faction whose existence challenged prevailing prejudices while providing a model for mutant coexistence. Yet, even within this framework, tensions remained, as external human factions, raiders, and opportunistic warbands viewed supermutants with suspicion, fear, or hostility, necessitating continuous vigilance, fortification, and occasional military engagement, all of which reinforced the martial skills that had become a hallmark of mutants from Mariposa onward. In addition to Marcus and Broken Hills, other supermutant factions scattered across the wasteland reflected divergent approaches to postmaster survival, some adopting more aggressive stances reminiscent of the Unity, raiding settlements indiscriminately, and asserting dominance through brute force, while others, influenced indirectly by Marcus' example or by circumstance, adopted isolationist strategies, focusing on self-preservation and internal cohesion rather than expansion or conquest, illustrating the variety of adaptive behaviors that FEV had produced in response to environmental pressures, social constraints, and the legacy of the Master. The significance of the Fallout 2 era for mutant history lies not only in the survival of these communities, but in the maturation of mutant society into distinct political and cultural entities capable of strategic thought, negotiation, and governance, demonstrating that the Forced Evolutionary Virus, while initially a tool of war and control, had inadvertently produced beings capable of constructing societies that could endure independently of human guidance or coercion, and in doing so, mutants evolved not just physically, but socially, developing norms, alliances, and identities that would shape their interactions with humans for decades to come. Furthermore, the presence of individuals such as Marcus, who retained intelligence, a memory of pre-war human culture, and moral reasoning, underscores the variability of FEV outcomes, highlighting that mutation did not inevitably produce mindless aggression or fanaticism, and that with proper leadership and organization, supermutants could achieve both survival and a measure of ethical stability, providing a counterpoint to the destructive and dogmatic unity of the Master, and establishing the foundation for subsequent communities such as Jacobstown, where the lessons of Broken Hills would inform policies regarding human-mutant relations, addiction management, and social integration. In essence, the mutants of Fallout 2 illustrate the transition from purely militarized instruments of the Master's vision into autonomous actors capable of creating, maintaining, and defending their own culture, an evolution shaped by necessity, circumstance, and the enduring effects of FEV. And this period in mutant history highlights both the potential and limitations of the virus. While it grants extraordinary physical capabilities and longevity, the survival of mutant communities ultimately depends on the intelligence, leadership, and cohesion of individuals capable of guiding them, a principle exemplified by Marcus and his followers, who represent the first significant step in establishing mutants, not as tools or victims of ideology, but as independent agents with agency, society, and a lasting presence in the post-apocalyptic world. The mutants of the Capital Wasteland, most prominently those originating from Vault 87, represent a continuation and intensification of the Forced Evolutionary Virus experiments, first conducted at Mariposa, yet their story diverges in important ways, as the FEV strain used in Vault 87 was specifically engineered to produce more stable, intelligent, and physically resilient supermutants, while still imposing the characteristic sterility and uniformity. And this refinement of the virus marked a new phase in mutant history, one that would dominate much of the Washington, D.C. region by 2277, the time of Fallout 3, when the player first encounters the pervasive influence of FEV's legacy across the Capital Wasteland. Vault 87, constructed as an isolated underground facility, was designated a control vault by West Tek, ostensibly to monitor the long-term effects of FEV exposure on human subjects in a controlled environment. Yet in practice it became the most dangerous and consequential breeding ground for post-war supermutants, as the experiments conducted there combined exposure to radiation, nutritional manipulation, and extended viral immersion to produce subjects who were both physically imposing and capable of independent thought, a combination that distinguished them from the simpler, more ideologically driven supermutants of the Master's Unity, and the somewhat socially oriented mutants of Broken Hills, and positioned them as both an immediate threat to surrounding settlements and as a crucial point of study for understanding FEV's ultimate capabilities. The emergence of these mutants was marked by both tragedy and horror, for the majority of Vault 87's residents were unwilling subjects, many of whom perished during initial exposure or became centaur-like failures, while a smaller number survived to become full supermutants, whose green, muscular forms and towering presence signified the unmistakable hallmark of FEV transformation, and whose intelligence allowed them to develop rudimentary social hierarchies, form patrols, and defend their territory from intruders, maintaining control over both the vault itself and the tunnels that connected it to the greater Capital Wasteland. These mutants, unlike those under Marcus or the Master, were not united under a single ideology or community purpose, and yet they retained the adaptive capabilities conferred by FEV, allowing them to exploit environmental hazards, improvise strategies against human settlements, and utilize the scattered resources of the post-apocalyptic landscape, which in turn reinforced their reputation as both dangerous and unpredictable adversaries, a perception widely held by local human factions such as the Enclave, the Brotherhood of Steel, and independent wasteland communities who encountered them, often with devastating consequences. The Capital Wasteland supermutants developed a range of social structures within the vault and in surrounding areas, with some factions remaining isolated and defensive, focusing on survival and preservation of their numbers, while others conducted raids on nearby human settlements or scavenged strategic points, demonstrating the variability of mutant behavior when freed from the centralized control of the Master, and highlighting the consequences of FEV-induced sterility, which created long-term pressures to recruit new human subjects for transformation in order to sustain their populations, a process that inevitably led to conflict with humans and other mutants alike. Within this context, the role of Vault 87, as both incubator and strategic stronghold, became central to the narrative of Fallout 3, as the player's journey reveals not only the physical dangers of the mutants themselves, but the ethical and historical implications of FEV experimentation, illustrating how a virus originally intended to create enhanced immunity and biological superiority evolved over generations to produce beings whose survival depended upon aggression, resourcefulness, and careful territorial control, yet whose existence remained fundamentally linked to human intervention, as without the initial experiments, the supermutants would never have existed. The Capital Wasteland mutants also exemplify the ongoing tension between intelligence and instinct, for while FEV granted cognitive enhancement in the Vault-born mutants, it did not always confer moral reasoning or foresight, resulting in societies that could organize militarily and strategically, but often acted in ways that humans perceived as cruel, arbitrary, or violent, a pattern that repeated in the scattered patrols, raiding parties, and factional disputes observed throughout the region, and underscored the duality of FEV as both creator and destroyer, producing beings capable of sophisticated thought and planning while simultaneously imposing physical and social constraints that led to conflict and marginalization. Furthermore, the legacy of Mariposa and the Master is visible in the Capital Wasteland mutants, as ideological residues of unity, whether through aggressive conquest or rigid hierarchy, persisted among certain groups, even as others, influenced by the surrounding human populations or environmental pressures, adapted more pragmatic or isolationist approaches, reflecting the enduring influence of early FEV experimentation on mutant culture and behavior, and demonstrating the virus's ability to shape both the biological and social evolution of its subjects over centuries. The mutants of Vault 87 and the greater Capital Wasteland ultimately became both a cautionary tale and a living laboratory, illustrating the consequences of manipulating evolution, the ethical ramifications of forced mutation, and the complex interplay between intelligence, aggression, and survival, and their presence in Fallout 3 provides a direct link between pre-war scientific hubris, the Master's catastrophic vision, and the post-war attempts by human and mutant communities to navigate a world transformed by nuclear fire and viral experimentation, establishing them as central actors in the ongoing saga of mutants and the continuing influence of the Forced Evolutionary Virus across the wasteland. In the aftermath of the chaos left by Vault 87's mutants and the broader post-Master fragmentation, Jacobstown emerged as a rare example of intentional mutant society building and coexistence, a settlement conceived and managed by Marcus, the same supermutant whose leadership in Broken Hills had demonstrated that intelligence, discipline, and ethical foresight could transform physically formidable mutants into functional communities capable of interacting peacefully with humans and other post-apocalyptic factions, and it is in Jacobstown that the principles of mutant integration, interspecies diplomacy, and adaptive governance are most clearly observed. For the town became a refuge, not only for supermutants seeking stability and autonomy after decades of conflict, but also for ghouls fleeing persecution, irradiated wasteland survivors, and humans sympathetic to the mutant plight, creating a rare hybrid society in which disparate post-human entities could coexist under a shared framework of mutual respect, labor contribution, and protection from external threats, all while retaining the essential characteristics and identities that defined each group. The founding of Jacobstown reflected both a pragmatic and philosophical evolution in mutant thinking, as Marcus leveraged the lessons learned from Broken Hills and his own experiences under the Master's Unity to create rules and institutions that prioritized communal safety, equitable resource distribution, and conflict resolution, recognizing that mutants' physical superiority alone was insufficient to sustain society, and that psychological stability, social cohesion, and trust between different populations were essential for long-term survival. And this approach contrasted sharply with the violence-driven hierarchy of the Master's army, demonstrating that the supermutants' enhanced intelligence and capacity for social organization could be harnessed for constructive purposes rather than purely militaristic or expansionist ends. Jacobstown's population, while dominated by supermutants, also included a significant number of ghouls, who brought their own experiences of survival, resilience, and cultural adaptation to the community, and whose inclusion not only broadened the knowledge base and labor pool, but also symbolized a broader ethic of inclusion and shared survival, with Marcus and his council deliberately fostering cooperation through shared projects, communal defense initiatives, and structured education of younger mutants in both combat and societal responsibilities, thereby creating an environment in which multiple post-human species could learn from one another, mitigate the social pathologies associated with isolation, and establish interdependent relationships, all of which served to stabilize the settlement against both internal disorder and external threats. The governance of Jacobstown relied on a council system wherein influential mutants, elder ghouls, and human advisors convened to make decisions regarding security, trade, resource allocation, and interaction with neighboring factions, blending meritocratic, democratic, and traditionalist elements in order to balance authority with accountability, and this political structure allowed the community to adapt dynamically to challenges while preventing the concentration of power that had proven fatal to the Master's Unity, a model that emphasized negotiation, collective problem-solving, and recognition of individual agency, all vital components for a population whose members were genetically and psychologically distinct, yet reliant upon mutual cooperation for survival. Trade and diplomacy formed another critical component of Jacobstown's strategy for coexistence, as Marcus recognized that isolationism could not ensure long-term security, and thus the settlement engaged in controlled exchanges with nearby human communities, caravans, and wandering mercenaries, providing labor, protection, and crafted goods in return for food, technology, and intelligence, with human traders often serving as intermediaries to negotiate agreements and reduce the potential for conflict, while mutant enforcers maintained security and order both internally and externally, their presence a deterrent to raiders and a demonstration that coexistence was maintained not only through ideology, but through practical, enforceable means, reflecting a sophisticated understanding of power, negotiation, and deterrence that had evolved from centuries of mutant experience with FEV, warfare, and post-apocalyptic survival. Social and cultural integration within Jacobstown also addressed the psychological vulnerabilities of supermutants, particularly those inherited from the Capital Wasteland and Vault 87 lineages, whose intelligence and exposure to stress often produced paranoia, aggression, or residual trauma from prior conflicts, including encounters with humans and nightkin hallucinations, and through mentorship programs, community roles, and structured routines, Marcus and his advisors provided pathways for individuals to channel their abilities productively while minimizing disruptive behavior, thereby reinforcing the stability of the settlement and enabling long-term survival, a model that contrasted sharply with the fragmented, leaderless supermutant warbands scattered elsewhere in the wasteland, who often fell prey to infighting, opportunistic human attacks, or social breakdown. Beyond practical governance and integration, Jacobstown also became a site of cultural and historical preservation for mutants, housing holotapes, records, and oral histories detailing FEV experimentation, the Master's Unity, Vault 87 experiments, and prior mutant-human interactions, allowing the population to maintain awareness of their collective past, transmit lessons to younger generations, and cultivate a sense of identity rooted in both shared hardship and agency, reinforcing social cohesion while preserving the moral memory of past abuses and mistakes, which in turn informed community norms regarding treatment of humans, ghouls, and fellow mutants. The inclusion of ghouls in particular demonstrated an intentional effort to broaden empathy and understanding across post-human boundaries, as Marcus recognized that the experiences of radiation-adapted humans shared parallels with the struggles of supermutants, including ostracization, vulnerability, and prejudice, and by fostering cooperative relationships between these groups, Jacobstown created a social microcosm in which diversity became an asset rather than a liability, enabling the pooling of skills, knowledge, and labor in ways that enhanced overall survivability and resilience, and providing a model for future mutant communities seeking to balance autonomy with interspecies collaboration. In sum, Jacobstown represents a watershed moment in mutant history, marking the transition from fragmented, ideologically driven, or survivalist factions to a socially integrated, self-governing, and diplomatically capable society, demonstrating that mutants, when guided by intelligence, ethical foresight, and social structure, could establish communities capable of long-term stability, coexistence, and cultural preservation. And in doing so, they not only survived, but contributed to the broader social fabric of the post-apocalyptic world, cementing Marcus's legacy as a leader who bridged the gap between raw physical power, historical awareness, and the moral and practical imperatives of community building in a wasteland shaped by FEV, nuclear devastation, and centuries of human and mutant conflict. Despite the establishment of communities such as Jacobstown, the relationship between supermutants and humans in the wasteland remained deeply strained, defined by cycles of fear, misunderstanding, and violent confrontation that had roots in the earliest experiments with FEV and the catastrophic expansion of the Master's Unity. For while some mutants, under leaders like Marcus, sought coexistence and stability, others persisted in behavior shaped by survival imperatives, biological imperatives, imposed by sterility, and residual aggression, leading to a proliferation of warbands, raiding parties, and militarized enclaves that preyed upon vulnerable human settlements, caravans, and trade routes. And these interactions became defining features of post-apocalyptic human-mutant relations, establishing a pattern of conflict that would endure for generations. The causes of this ongoing warfare were both environmental and biological, as FEV-induced sterility created constant pressure to capture new human stock for mutation, or to seize resources sufficient to maintain independent populations, while the wasteland's scarcity of food, clean water, and technological salvage drove mutants into direct competition with humans, particularly in regions such as Southern California, the Capital Wasteland, and the remnants of the hub, where mutants, often numbering in dozens or even hundreds, could overwhelm unprepared settlements with sheer strength and coordinated attack, making them both a tactical threat and a symbol of the consequences of unchecked mutation and post-war chaos. Super mutant raids typically involved strategic use of both brute force and the environment, with warbands employing stealth, ambushes, and knowledge of terrain to maximize effectiveness, a practice that combined lessons inherited from the Master's military doctrine with independent innovation shaped by centuries of adaptation. And these raids were often punctuated by the use of advanced weaponry, scavenged from pre-war caches, captured from human forces, or produced within mutant-controlled facilities, demonstrating that, despite the collapse of centralized leadership, mutants retained and adapted technical skills to maintain their dominance, while simultaneously exacerbating tensions with surrounding human populations and perpetuating cycles of retaliation and reprisal. The human response to mutant aggression varied, depending on local resources, organization, and ideology, ranging from passive avoidance and fortified settlements to active militias, caravan escorts, and organized counter-raids conducted by groups such as the Brotherhood of Steel or the Followers of the Apocalypse, whose interventions were often limited by logistical constraints and the mutants' physical superiority. Yet these encounters underscored the fact that mutant-human interactions were not uniformly dominated by brute force, but instead were shaped by strategy, negotiation, and the balance of power, with each side constantly adapting to the tactics, technologies, and behaviors of the other, resulting in a complex and dynamic military landscape that defined the post-apocalyptic era. Within this context, mutants exhibited considerable variation in conduct, with some factions maintaining disciplined raiding protocols that minimized casualties among conscripted humans in order to preserve future recruitment potential, while other groups, particularly those descended from the more chaotic splinters of Vault 87, or the Master's warbands, engaged in indiscriminate violence, reflecting both the psychological effects of prolonged FEV exposure and the lack of centralized social or ideological oversight, and highlighting the divergence between mutants capable of ethical judgment and those whose behavior was dominated by aggression, survival imperatives, and learned hostility. The consequences of these conflicts extended beyond immediate casualties or resource losses, shaping the political and social landscape of the wasteland, as settlements were forced to adapt to the persistent threat of super-mutant incursions, fortifying perimeters, developing intelligence networks, and negotiating alliances with neighboring communities to pool resources and share strategic information, a process that reinforced the perception of mutants as both omnipresent and unpredictable threats, while also driving innovation and cooperation among humans. demonstrating that the legacy of FEV mutation influenced not only the physical capabilities of mutants, but also the broader socio-political dynamics of the post-nuclear world. Significant historical episodes, such as the skirmishes near Junktown, the Hub, and various caravan routes, illustrate how mutants leveraged both mobility and tactical ingenuity, combining superior strength, coordinated assaults, and psychological intimidation to achieve objectives that would have been unattainable through conventional combat, and these encounters became ingrained in the oral histories and collective memory of human populations, cementing the supermutants' reputation as both a cautionary example of genetic experimentation and as an enduring existential threat, while simultaneously highlighting the limits of FEV-enhanced aggression in the absence of ideological cohesion or strategic leadership, which often led to splintered warbands being repelled or neutralized by organized human resistance. The psychological dimension of mutant-human conflict also played a critical role, as fear and prejudice on both sides perpetuated cycles of mistrust and retaliation, with humans interpreting supermutant aggression as inherent malevolence, while mutants, conditioned by generations of combat, exposure to human hostility, and residual trauma from experimental origins, perceived humans as both resource and threat, creating a feedback loop in which violence became both cause and consequence of interaction, and reinforcing the broader narrative that post-FEV societies, whether human or mutant, were fundamentally shaped by survival imperatives and the lingering scars of pre-war experimentation. Ultimately, the ongoing conflicts between supermutants and humans in the wasteland demonstrate that the history of mutants cannot be understood solely through the lens of biological transformation, technological augmentation, or military capability, but must also incorporate the complex interplay of social adaptation, resource competition, environmental pressures, and the enduring legacies of ideology and trauma, as each encounter, raid, or negotiation reflects centuries of accumulated experience, experimentation, and evolution, and shapes the continuing narrative of mutants as both a physically dominant and socially complex species whose interactions with humans define not only the possibilities of coexistence, but the limits of survival in a world irrevocably altered by nuclear fire and the indiscriminate hand of science. In this way, supermutants emerge in Fallout history not merely as antagonists, but as agents of ecological, social, and political change, whose presence forces humans to innovate, cooperate, and confront the consequences of past hubris, while simultaneously illustrating that the legacy of FEV, the master, and post-war mutation continues to reverberate across the wasteland, shaping behavior, societal structures, and interspecies relations for generations, a testament to the enduring significance of mutants in the broader historical and cultural landscape of the Fallout universe. Among the most remarkable developments in the post-master history of mutants is the evolution of the Nightkin, an elite caste of supermutants whose specialized abilities, strategic deployment, and technological augmentation through stealth boys represent both the zenith of FEV adaptation and the tragic consequences of prolonged reliance on artificial enhancement. For while ordinary supermutants relied primarily on physical superiority, numbers, and brute force to assert dominance in the wasteland, Nightkin combined intelligence, tactical sophistication, and the capacity for near invisibility, granting them unprecedented advantages in reconnaissance, infiltration, and assassination. yet simultaneously exposing them to profound psychological vulnerabilities that would define the trajectory of their society. Originating primarily from Vault 87, the Nightkin were selected for their cognitive capacity and physical resilience, often distinguished from other supermutants by their ability to plan, coordinate, and execute complex operations independently. Yet their defining technological tool, the Stealth Boy, became both an asset and a liability, as prolonged and repeated exposure to the device's quantum cloaking interference altered neurological pathways, resulting in auditory and visual hallucinations, paranoia, dissociative episodes, and, in extreme cases, full-blown psychosis, a pattern observed across generations, illustrating the delicate interplay between genetic enhancement, environmental pressure, and technological dependency, and highlighting the unintended consequences of FEV experiments when combined with experimental pre-war devices. The Nightkin Society, to the extent that it existed as a cohesive structure, was highly secretive, hierarchical, and ritualized, with individuals vying for mastery of stealth techniques, combat proficiency, and strategic insight, often conducting exercises and patrols designed to enforce discipline and maintain operational readiness. Yet this same secrecy contributed to isolation, social fragmentation, and inter-individual mistrust, as hallucinations and paranoia led Nightkin to perceive threats both real and imagined, creating a culture in which collaboration was necessary but inherently unstable, and where loyalty could be compromised by psychological instability, emphasizing that technological and biological augmentation cannot substitute for stable social structures and governance. Operationally, Nightkin leveraged their Stealth Boys for a range of military and espionage missions, from surveillance and ambush to infiltration of human settlements and rival mutant factions, often exploiting invisibility to bypass defenses, neutralize key targets, and create confusion and terror among adversaries, a tactic that extended the historical pattern of mutant advantage beyond brute strength to include intelligence, psychological manipulation, and situational control, and reflecting the evolutionary trajectory of FEV subjects who, unshackled from the Master's centralized command, developed capabilities tailored to the post-apocalyptic environment, yet simultaneously faced significant risks of operational failure due to hallucinations, disorientation, and cognitive overload, induced by over-reliance on Stealth Boys. The cognitive impact of Stealth Boys was compounded by the environmental stresses of the Capital Wasteland, where resource scarcity, radiation exposure, and hostile encounters reinforced stress, and Nightkin often experienced persistent fear and hypervigilance, with some developing long-term delusions of omnipresence, invisibility outside of Stealth Boy use, or conspiratorial surveillance by unseen enemies, conditions that further complicated social cohesion and mission planning, and made training, mentorship, and hierarchical enforcement critical yet imperfect solutions for maintaining operational effectiveness, demonstrating that even enhanced mutants were susceptible to cognitive deterioration under extreme conditions. Culturally, Nightkin developed a mythology around Stealth Boys, treating the devices as both sacred instruments and badges of status, with proficiency in stealth operations conferring respect and authority within the group, while misuse, failure, or psychological collapse could result in ostracization, ritual punishment, or violent confrontation, reinforcing both the benefits and dangers of technological dependence, and illustrating a broader theme in mutant history. that FEV-induced physical and intellectual superiority is inseparable from the social and psychological consequences that arise from environmental, technological, and interpersonal pressures, creating a population simultaneously powerful, adaptive, and precariously balanced. Historically, Nightkin engagements reveal their dual role as both predators and protectors, capable of defending mutant enclaves, enforcing internal law, and conducting strategic offensives against human settlements or rival mutant factions, yet their operations were often limited by psychological instability, necessitating small, disciplined teams to achieve objectives, highlighting the operational limits imposed by the interplay of intelligence, FEV, biology, and technological augmentation, and underscoring the broader lesson that the evolutionary potential conferred by the virus is constrained by social and cognitive factors, which, in the case of Nightkin, manifests as a fragile elite class whose influence is significant but ultimately unstable. The spread and influence of Nightkin extended beyond Vault 87 and the Capital Wasteland, as their techniques, culture, and tactics disseminated through contact with other supermutants, human survivors, and scattered post-apocalyptic settlements, creating a legacy of stealth, strategic intelligence, and technological manipulation that would inform mutant behavior for decades, yet simultaneously propagating the risks of psychological fragility, hallucinations, and factional splintering, as knowledge of stealth techniques, without the social support structures necessary to mitigate cognitive stress, often resulted in isolated Nightkin becoming threats to both humans and fellow mutants, further complicating the postmaster landscape. In summary, the Nightkin and their use of stealth boys represent a paradoxical chapter in mutant history, a population capable of extraordinary intelligence, strategic foresight, and lethal effectiveness, yet simultaneously vulnerable to the neurological and social consequences of technological and biological augmentation, illustrating that the evolutionary path forged by FEV is not linear or guaranteed, and that the most capable mutants are often the most precariously balanced, dependent on environmental support, social cohesion, and careful management of technological tools, and that the history of Nightkin, as documented in Vault 87 records, wasteland encounters, and survivor testimonies, serves as both a testament to the potential of FEV and a cautionary narrative regarding the limits of forced evolution when combined with artificial augmentation and prolonged isolation in a harsh post-nuclear world. In the aftermath of the Master's death and the fragmentation of the Unity, the Wasteland became a crucible for the emergence of independent supermutant leaders and factions, as the absence of centralized authority allowed mutants to develop localized hierarchies, consolidate power, and adapt to the challenges of survival, governance, and conflict in a post-apocalyptic environment, resulting in a complex mosaic of groups whose goals, methods, and relationships with humans and other mutants varied widely, yet all were informed by the shared legacy of FEV-induced strength, durability, and, in some cases, enhanced intelligence. Notable among these leaders was Marcus, whose efforts in Broken Hills, and later Jacobstown, demonstrated the potential for enlightened supermutant leadership, emphasizing stability, social cohesion, and ethical coexistence with humans and ghouls. Yet beyond his influence, numerous warbands arose, often led by more aggressive or opportunistic figures who sought to exploit the power vacuum for territorial control, resource acquisition, and the forced conversion of humans into additional mutants, reflecting both the survival imperative imposed by FEV sterility and the residual military conditioning inherited from the Master's unity, and highlighting the divergence in post-Master leadership philosophies. These factions were typically organized around charismatic or physically dominant leaders, who commanded loyalty through strength, reputation, or fear, establishing internal hierarchies and operational rules that allowed for coordinated raids, defensive strategies, and resource management. And while some groups maintained cohesion over years or decades, others were prone to rapid fragmentation due to internal conflict, human counterattacks, or psychological instability induced by prolonged exposure to environmental stressors, combat, or, in the case of elite Nightkin factions, technological dependence on stealth boys, illustrating the fragility of mutant social structures in the absence of overarching ideology. Regional dominance by supermutant factions often depended on geography, population density, and access to pre-war technology, with mutants occupying defensible locations such as Vault 87 Inches, the Capital Wasteland, the foothills surrounding Broken Hills, or abandoned military installations, allowing them to exert influence over nearby human settlements, trade routes, and wasteland territories, while isolated mutants remained vulnerable to raiders, human militias, and rival mutant warbands, creating a dynamic equilibrium in which territorial control fluctuated over time and was contested both violently and diplomatically, reflecting the adaptive strategies employed by mutants in response to environmental pressures and competition for survival. The diversity of supermutant leadership styles is evident in recorded interactions across the wasteland, where some leaders adopted pragmatic policies similar to Marcus, prioritizing stability, trade, and controlled engagement with humans, while others, influenced by the militaristic traditions of the Master or by the psychological effects of FEV, favored aggressive expansion, coercion, and systematic raids, demonstrating that mutation alone did not determine behavior, but that social, cultural, and environmental factors played crucial roles in shaping decision-making, operational priorities, and intergroup relations, and that post-Master mutants were capable of both constructive and destructive leadership, depending on circumstances and individual psychology. The operational tactics of these factions reflected their physical and cognitive capacities, combining brute strength, ambush strategies, improvised weaponry, and, in the case of Nightkin, or other technologically adept mutants, stealth and reconnaissance, to achieve objectives ranging from territory acquisition and resource protection to the abduction of humans for forced mutation or labor, demonstrating that supermutants adapted not only biologically but strategically to the demands of a decentralized wasteland, evolving operational doctrines that were both flexible and context-dependent, and illustrating the continuity of martial competence despite the absence of a unifying ideology. Alliances, rivalries, and inter-faction negotiations further complicated the landscape, with some mutants forming temporary coalitions to repel human incursions, monopolize critical resources, or eliminate competitors, while rivalries and territorial disputes frequently led to violent engagements, internal coups, and the splintering of warbands, highlighting the tension between individual ambition and collective survival in mutant society, and the consequences of leadership decisions often shaped not only the fate of a single faction, but the broader strategic and demographic patterns of mutant populations across the wasteland. Beyond direct combat and territorial control, influential leaders also shaped mutant culture through mentorship, codification of behavioral norms, and the establishment of social hierarchies, teaching younger mutants skills in combat, survival, and navigation of complex post-human societies, thereby preserving knowledge of FEV history, tactical lessons, and environmental adaptation, and ensuring that mutants retained a coherent identity despite centuries of fragmentation, decentralization, and environmental upheaval. Ultimately, the rise of super-mutant leaders and factions illustrates the evolution of mutants from instruments of the Master's ideological vision to autonomous actors in the post-apocalyptic world, capable of self-governance, strategic thinking, and social organization, yet constantly constrained by biological imperatives, psychological vulnerabilities, and the demands of survival, demonstrating that the legacy of FEV is both empowering and precarious, producing beings of extraordinary capability whose success and stability are determined as much by leadership, cohesion, and adaptive strategy as by raw physical power, and underscoring the enduring complexity of mutant history as a tapestry of factionalism, leadership, and interaction with humans in a world forever altered by nuclear devastation and genetic experimentation. The legacy of the Forced Evolutionary Virus extends far beyond physical transformation, encompassing profound ethical, societal, and existential consequences that have shaped both mutant and human populations in the post-apocalyptic world. As the deliberate manipulation of human biology to produce supermutants raises questions regarding consent, autonomy, and the moral limits of scientific experimentation, for the initial experiments at Mariposa, Vault 87, and other West Tek facilities were conducted without informed consent, often on unwilling human subjects, and involved procedures that resulted in extreme physical alteration, psychological trauma, sterility, and, in many cases, death, creating a moral foundation upon which the history of mutants is inextricably tied to exploitation, coercion, and systemic abuse, a legacy that persists in the social memory and interactions between mutants and humans across the wasteland. Beyond questions of consent, the consequences of FEV mutation also include the biological and social ramifications inherent to the virus itself, as supermutants are endowed with extraordinary strength, durability, and longevity, yet are rendered sterile, creating a population whose survival is dependent upon continuous introduction of new human subjects, whether through voluntary cooperation, coercion, or abduction, a condition that generates inherent tension with surrounding human communities and forces mutants to confront the paradox of their own existence, possessing immense physical power but lacking the natural means to reproduce, which in turn drives behavior patterns including territorial aggression, raids, and selective recruitment, demonstrating how biological manipulation produces cascading ethical and practical dilemmas that extend across generations. The ethical implications of FEV mutation are further compounded by the psychological and social effects observed in supermutants, particularly in cases of nightkin and other technologically augmented lineages, where dependence on devices such as stealth boys, combined with cognitive enhancement and environmental stresses, produces paranoia, dissociation, and social fragmentation, highlighting the unintended consequences of artificial intervention in both biology and cognition, and raising critical questions about the responsibilities of creators toward their subjects, the moral costs of forced enhancement, and the long-term societal impact of introducing genetically altered beings into a post-apocalyptic human ecosystem. These consequences extend into the realm of interspecies and intraspecies relations, as mutants interact with humans, ghouls, and other survivors, creating patterns of fear, mistrust, alliance, and conflict, and illustrating that the ethical consequences of FEV mutation are inseparable from practical and political concerns, as human communities must contend with both the existential threat posed by physically dominant mutants and the moral responsibility of engaging with sentient beings whose existence was engineered without their consent, thereby embedding the ethics of mutation into the ongoing social and political fabric of the wasteland. Historically, the Masters' Unity provides the most stark example of ethical collapse, as ideological zeal and scientific hubris combined to justify the forced transformation of entire human populations, resulting in widespread suffering, death, and the loss of autonomy, while subsequent generations of mutants, including factions led by Marcus and communities such as Jacobstown, demonstrate that ethical frameworks can emerge even among FEV-altered populations, emphasizing social cohesion, diplomacy, and coexistence. Yet these examples coexist alongside rogue warbands, nightkin operating in isolation, and remnants of masterist ideology, underscoring the persistent ethical tension between power, survival, and moral responsibility inherent in mutant existence. The societal impact of FEV mutation also includes the formation of complex mutant cultures, hierarchies, and governance structures, as exemplified by Jacobstown and Broken Hills, where intelligence, strategic thinking, and leadership are leveraged to create functioning communities capable of integration with humans and ghouls, preserving knowledge of mutant history, and fostering cooperative behavior, illustrating that the consequences of mutation are not purely destructive, but can produce novel social forms that navigate the ethical and practical challenges of coexistence, while also acknowledging that these structures are continually vulnerable to internal dysfunction, factional splintering, and external threat. Further ethical considerations emerge when examining the human response to mutants, as fear, prejudice, and historical trauma influence policies of containment, retaliation, and eradication, which in turn perpetuate cycles of violence and mistrust, creating a complex moral landscape in which the original ethical violations of FEV experimentation reverberate through successive generations, affecting both mutant and human behavior, and shaping the political, cultural, and ecological dynamics of the wasteland. The long-term consequences of FEV mutation are also observable in the demographic and ecological impacts of mutant populations. As the sterility of supermutants necessitates continual expansion through acquisition of human stock or territorial dominance, producing persistent pressure on human settlements, resource distribution, and the balance of power across regions such as Southern California, the Capital Wasteland, and the former hub territories, thereby embedding the ethical consequences of genetic manipulation directly into the ongoing survival and evolution of both mutant and human societies. Ultimately, the ethics and consequences of FEV mutation illustrate a continuum of moral, social, and biological dilemmas, encompassing the initial injustice of forced experimentation, the practical and existential pressures imposed by sterility and enhanced capabilities, the psychological vulnerabilities induced by environmental and technological stresses, and the ongoing cycles of conflict, diplomacy, and cultural development that define mutant-human relations, demonstrating that the legacy of the virus is inseparable from the moral choices of its creators the leadership strategies of mutant communities, and the adaptive responses of humans. And that understanding the history of mutants in Fallout requires recognition of the intertwined ethical, social, and evolutionary dimensions that continue to shape behavior, identity, and survival in a post-apocalyptic world forever altered by scientific hubris and nuclear catastrophe. Looking toward the future of mutants in the Fallout universe, the trajectory of supermutants is shaped by the complex interplay of FEV-induced biology, environmental pressures, societal adaptation, and the ethical legacies of pre-war experimentation, illustrating a multifaceted path in which their physical superiority, cognitive capacities, and historical experiences will continue to influence their survival, interactions with humans, and cultural evolution. For while mutants have endured centuries of nuclear devastation, ideological collapse, and intermittent conflict, their continued existence remains contingent upon adaptive strategies, leadership, social cohesion, and the capacity to navigate relationships with both human and post-human communities, suggesting that their future is neither predetermined nor uniform, but rather a dynamic continuum influenced by geography, resource availability, and the decisions of individual and collective actors within mutant society. One potential trajectory emphasizes the consolidation of mutant communities under capable leadership, akin to Marcus in Broken Hills or Jacobstown, wherein social structures, governance, and ethical frameworks foster internal stability, sustainable resource management, and controlled engagement with human populations, allowing mutants to coexist peacefully while retaining autonomy and demonstrating that intelligence and organization can mitigate the inherent biological constraints of sterility, physical dominance, and susceptibility to psychological stress, thereby enabling a resilient, self-sufficient future in which mutants play a proactive role in shaping post-apocalyptic society rather than remaining solely as aggressors or relics of past experiments. Alternatively, mutants who exist in fragmented, isolated, or psychologically unstable groups, such as Nightkin splinter warbands or unaffiliated Volt-87 derivatives, are likely to continue patterns of sporadic aggression, raiding, and internal conflict, driven by sterility, resource scarcity, and the cognitive side effects of prolonged FEV exposure, illustrating that without social cohesion, mentorship, or integration into larger community structures, even highly capable mutants remain vulnerable to fragmentation, decline, or extinction, highlighting the precarious balance between power and stability that defines the mutant condition, and reinforcing the principle that physical superiority does not inherently guarantee societal sustainability. The future of mutants is also intertwined with human perceptions, alliances, and responses, as the ethical, cultural, and strategic choices of human populations continue to shape the survival and evolution of mutant communities, whether through tolerance, trade, militarized opposition, or integration into hybrid settlements, suggesting that human-mutant interaction will remain a critical factor in determining the success, stability, and expansion of mutant society, and that history's lessons, from the Master's catastrophic unity to the cooperative models of Jacobstown, will inform the strategies and expectations of both species in navigating coexistence. Technological and environmental factors further influence prospective mutant trajectories, as access to pre-war weaponry, medical equipment, and knowledge of FEV properties allows certain groups to enhance capabilities, compensate for vulnerabilities, and maintain strategic dominance, while ongoing environmental challenges, such as radiation exposure, scarcity of uncontaminated resources, and the unpredictability of wasteland conditions, continue to impose selective pressures that favor adaptability, innovation, and pragmatic decision-making, reinforcing the evolutionary and social constraints that have always governed mutant survival, and highlighting the necessity for intelligent, coordinated management of both resources and personnel. Cultural and educational practices will also play a decisive role in the future of mutants, as communities that prioritize the preservation of historical knowledge, tactical skills, and social norms can transmit lessons learned from prior centuries of experimentation, conflict, and cooperation, ensuring that younger generations internalize both the strengths and vulnerabilities inherent to FEV-altered physiology and fostering resilience against internal division, psychological deterioration, and external threats, thereby creating the conditions for long-term continuity and evolution in the absence of the centralized control once exerted by the master. Furthermore, mutant identity will likely continue to evolve in response to interspecies contact and integration as cooperative settlements, shared labor, and interspecies diplomacy foster hybridized social norms and ethical frameworks, allowing mutants to redefine their place in the post-apocalyptic ecosystem, balance survival imperatives with social responsibility, and potentially shift from a paradigm defined by fear and aggression to one characterized by negotiation, mutual protection, and cultural exchange, an evolution already observable in the practices of Jacobstown, where ghouls, humans, and mutants coexist within structured governance and collective economic activity. However, the specter of Nightkin-like psychological instability and factional fragmentation remains a persistent risk, as the cognitive and neurological consequences of FEV and technological augmentation continue to challenge social cohesion, decision-making, and operational reliability, illustrating that even the most advanced mutants require structured communities, mentorship, and ethical oversight to prevent the recurrence of hallucination-induced chaos, internal strife, or destructive behavior, and highlighting that future mutant stability is contingent not solely on physical capabilities, but on the effective management of psychological and social vulnerabilities. In the broader context of wasteland geopolitics, mutants are poised to remain influential actors, whether as autonomous communities, strategic allies, or adversaries to human populations, and their future interactions will continue to reflect the lessons of prior centuries. The importance of leadership, ethical guidance, social cohesion, resource management, and strategic foresight, demonstrating that the trajectory of mutants is inseparable from both their biological heritage and their capacity for intelligent, ethical engagement with the challenges of survival, coexistence, and cultural persistence. Ultimately, the future of mutants represents a convergence of biology, culture, ethics, and environment. A complex and dynamic evolution in which the decisions of leaders, the cohesion of communities, the adaptability of individuals, and the responses of human and post-human populations collectively shape the ongoing history of FEV-altered beings, illustrating that mutants are not static relics of experimentation, but living participants in a post-apocalyptic world, capable of both extraordinary achievement and catastrophic failure, and that the lessons of the past, ranging from the master's ideological dominance to the cooperative societies of Marcus and Jacobstown, will continue to inform their survival, influence, and legacy across the wasteland, ensuring that the story of mutants remains central to the ongoing narrative of the Fallout universe, a testament to the enduring consequences of human hubris, the resilience of engineered life, and the capacity for post-human societies to adapt, survive, and evolve in a world shaped by nuclear fire and the indelible mark of FEV.